Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Atkinson, a member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and I'm also the Office Administrator at Barnes & Thornburg. It's great to see everyone today. Today, we are pleased to present in our series, Pulling at the Roots of Poverty, a forum about legal aid entitled Justice for All. Please help me thank National Church Residences for their series support and Barnes & Thornburg and Ohio Legal Assistance Foundation for their support of today's forum. Our legal system can be complex, intimidating, and prohibitively expensive, and ultimately out of reach of those most in need of access to justice. Our speakers today bring a wealth of knowledge and a passion for helping those in need. Please welcome Ohio Supreme Court Justice Judith French, Executive Director of Ohio State Legal Services Association, Tom Weeks, Assistant Professor at the College of Public Health and the Moritz College of Law at OSU, Micah Berman, and our host and moderator today, Joe Ingles, reporter with the Statehouse News Bureau. Please welcome all of them. All right, welcome all of our speakers, and Joe, the podium is yours.
Well, this is really awesome. I want to thank everyone for allowing me to be here and be part of this discussion. I hope to learn things today, just as you will learn things from these guests who have a lot to talk about, especially with our legal system. It's so important that people feel that they have recourse in our society when bad things happen to them and they feel like they need justice. So today we're going to talk about that, and that will be an important part of this discussion, how people can go about getting the justice they need for a problem. So let me first of all start out by asking Tom, what exactly is legal aid? Explain it to us.
I'm going to give a quick explanation that will basically provide some background for the discussion we're going to have today. The first legal aid societies were founded in this country in the late 19th century. The first was in New York in 1876, and they were volunteer organizations that provided help to new immigrants. And that idea gradually expanded around the United States. It continued to be an urban phenomenon, small volunteer organizations. In Columbus, the Columbus Bar Association started the Legal Aid Society of Columbus in 1953. In the 60s, as part of the Great Society and the Office of Economic Opportunity, money started coming into legal aid to try to expand beyond the cities and out around the entire country. It was very successful. And in 1974, actually the last piece of legislation signed by President Nixon was the Legal Services Corporation Act, which created the Federal Legal Services Corporation that funds and oversees the federal contribution to legal aid. In the late 1980s, the Ohio Legal Assistance Foundation was formed in Ohio primarily to administer the interest on lawyer trust accounts, IOLTA system here, which was a wonderful discovery of a way to generate money. Most of it went for legal aid, except that when the interest rates collapsed in 2008, most of that money went away. I actually looked at the Supreme Court website this morning on the task force report, and 90% of that income disappeared in the course of a year at that point. Legal Aid Society of Columbus lost over 40% of our funding, over 40% of the staff. So what we do is we provide civil legal services to low-income people. What we don't do is provide criminal legal services to anybody. We're not the public defender. It's actually a point that we clarified in the preparation for our panel today. And so if we represent people of low income, 200% or lower in Columbus, and if a family is eligible for our services, it's free. There's no sliding fee scale or anything like that. So to talk about what we do, the Legal Aid Society here, and every legal aid society, every city has its own legal aid society, and it's something that says something about the community, and I hope it's something people are proud of in Columbus. The work that we do here is divided among 5 teams. The first is the benefits team. So we get poor kids on Medicaid, we get seniors on Medicare, we help unemployed workers get on unemployment benefits, we help veterans and their families get the benefits that they're entitled to. And there are many other benefit programs we work on. As an example, a couple years ago, we represented a 58-year-old woman who had worked all of her life. She'd become disabled. She had gone on Social Security, disability, and Medicare. She got sicker and sicker, and she needed a liver transplant. And you have to have that pre-approved with Medicare. They denied it. And so she came to us. We represented her. We represented her in front of an administrative law judge where we lost, and appealed to the appeal council where we were successful and she got the operation. So it's unusual that we were able to actually save our clients' lives, but it did happen that time. And that's a classic example of the kind of cases that we do in the benefits area. We have a consumer foreclosure team. We saved many homes for families during the foreclosure crisis, but we also had some impact in the way the system affected them. So for example, we had one client who had a mortgage that was insured by the USDA. And when they sent, and these insured mortgages require some support for the families before they get foreclosed. So they sent out the notice, it gave the right to appeal. There's a PO box. We sent that in by certified mail and it came back. And it turned out that every notice sent out in the eastern region of the United States had the wrong PO box on it. It was a non-existent PO box. So we were able to work with USDA, get the notice fixed, rewrite the notice with them to make it better and more understandable for the low-income people who were getting it, and slow down the foreclosures that had started while the notices were going out with the wrong PO box. In the housing area, traditionally we've defended evictions, we've tried to keep people in public housing, we've protected their Section 8 vouchers, and that's important work, makes a big difference to families. But it doesn't expand the supply of safe, decent, affordable housing. And so recently we've tried to put more focus on how we might do that. And so we have been working closely with the city attorney's office, code enforcement, the Pride Centers, other housing developers like Homes on the Hill, Community Development for All People, trying to improve the supply of good housing by, for example, helping people understand how to use the escrow provisions that we have in Ohio, which are grossly underused, so that our hope is that when people have problems with their houses, their rental houses, instead of just stopping paying the rent and moving out, which is bad for everybody, they'll pay into court, which is a little bit complicated to do, and that money is then used to improve the premises. So it's really a win-win. So we're working on that. Strangely enough, we have a tax team, which seems counterintuitive, but we help people get into uncollectible status. We help people exercise their right to an innocent spouse exemption from collection. And one of the great things about that program is it's actually funded by the Internal Revenue Service. And I think it says a lot about our country that our government pays for lawyers to defend people who are having a disagreement with their taxing authority, something we can be happy about. And finally, something that people are familiar with, we have a family team, and mostly you know what we do in that area. We get protection orders, we protect kids and adults, mostly women, from domestic violence. We also do custody cases where we can help keep children in safe, stable families. So that's the overview, and we'll probably get into more of the details later.
Wow.
And I can follow up a little bit on that. I mean, I think the bottom line is legal aid is any kind of legal assistance that can be provided to someone who wouldn't be able to afford a lawyer. But just from listening to what Tom said, you see that it's not just about providing a lawyer, it's also providing programs, for example, that just educate the community broadly about legal proceedings or anything that they might be having difficulty with from a legal perspective. So when you hear that term legal aid, that's what it's referring to, is civil legal aid as opposed to something in the criminal proceedings. But the other term that we use a lot and that we kind of throw out very broadly is access to justice. That's kind of a broad umbrella of different topics that relate to allowing people to get justice for themselves. It might mean removing a language barrier. It might mean removing a physical barrier so that you can physically get to the courthouse if you have a disability. It might mean legal aid and providing a lawyer for you, or it might mean providing self-help if you've decided to represent yourself in court. So when you hear those terms, that access to justice term is one that's fairly broad, but legal aid relates more specifically to providing litigants or potential litigants with any kind of assistance that they might be able to use.
Now, I know you were talking, Tom, about handling a lot of medical cases, for example. And I know that's kind of your area of expertise, Mike Berman. Can you talk about that and how that works?
Sure. So what I want to talk about is the concept of medical legal partnerships, which is a concept that's really expanding very quickly all over the country. There's now close to 300 of them around the country. And the idea is that attorneys become part of the healthcare team. They're essentially integrated into the healthcare team. And so in a sense, they can treat and diagnose legal issues that are interfering with health. So the obvious case, trying to get insurance or coverage, Medicaid coverage to cover a health-related concern is the obvious case, but it's built on a deeper foundation that a lot of what interferes with health are the social conditions, the economic conditions, the environmental conditions that people are dealing with outside of the healthcare system. So the idea of medical legal partnerships is people are coming into the healthcare system, often hospitals, dealing with problems that the doctors there can treat the immediate surface level pieces of, but in order to really get to the root of the problem, oftentimes legal assistance is needed. And it's a lot of things that Tom just talked about, is just reframing it in a different context. So if you are repeatedly coming into the hospital because of a domestic violence situation, the doctor can treat the injuries, but you may well need a lawyer to actually get to the root of the problem. Or if you're dealing with an unsafe housing situation where the landlord has let mold infestations occur and so forth, you might have kids that are coming in for asthma, acute incidents of asthma. The doctor, again, can treat that, but if the underlying problem isn't dealt with, the doctor is going to be seeing that patient again. So the medical legal partnership idea is that you have a medical partner on the one hand, usually a hospital, and then you have a legal partner on the other side, which is usually, in most cases, legal aid, and you're bringing them together. So the idea here is that as opposed to the doctor just telling someone that you seem to have a problem, you should go see a lawyer, you actually have a lawyer who is there on site in the hospital, in the healthcare setting, so the doctors and attorneys can work together to get that person immediate help, immediate assistance to deal with that underlying problem. And as hopefully we'll have the chance to talk about, ideally the doctors and lawyers and other members of the healthcare team don't just address that individual case, but they can then try to identify the systemic issues in the community and try to deal with those at more of a population level.
Well, that perfectly leads into my next question, which is, we understand, from listening to you, how this can be important to the person who seeks the justice and needs legal aid. But Justice French, maybe you can answer this. How does legal aid benefit the entire community in general?
Well, it helps the community in general by first, ideally, providing some equality. So that everyone, no matter their social or economic status, has access to the judicial system. But if you just think about one example, about, let's say you have a victim of domestic violence, a woman with children who wouldn't otherwise be able to understand or know how to get a civil protection order. Well, if you have a lawyer from legal aid going with that woman to the courthouse, helping her get a civil protection order, well, now you're affecting an entire family. Now you're protecting a family that potentially would have been homeless. You're helping those kids that might have an absentee problem at school, or a working parent that might have an absentee from work. So when you look at just one of those examples, it really provides stability for that entire family, and all that stability, all that goes along with that stability. And any of the other kinds of examples that Tom talked about, if you're thinking about housing, keeping someone in their home, if you're talking about veterans benefits or health benefits, disability benefits, of actually keeping someone in a home, in a neighborhood, then you're keeping that neighborhood more stable. But from a very idealistic standpoint, you really are providing equal access for all of the community.
Can I follow up on that a little bit? And I think that is the most important answer to your question. Another answer to your question, though, is to take Justice French's domestic violence example further. The work that legal aid does stopping domestic violence also helps society in other ways, including it saves money on police runs, prosecutions, jailing of abusers, lost wages, missed work for employers. We have 166,000 incidents of domestic violence in the country annually, and the medical and mental health costs caused by those are in the range of $215 million. So there's a financial benefit there. And also, how can you put a value on what it means for a child not to have to watch one parent beating, assaulting, hurting, or even killing the other, much less experiencing that themselves? So it's a important benefit for the entire society. There are other ways that I think we tend not to recognize those benefits. So, for example, when we get a family on Medicaid or a senior on Medicare, they stop being charity cases at the hospital and the doctor. They become generators of income for the hospital and the doctor. They also get preventive care, so they're less of a burden on the overtaxed emergency rooms. Another one where you think of the individual, I mentioned foreclosure cases. When a foreclosure is avoided, property values in the neighborhood, other property values are protected. So, for example, the foreclosure of one home depresses neighborhood values by 2.1%. So in addition to helping the family, it stabilizes the neighborhood. Foreclosures cost on average $34,000 each in public resources. So there's some fact and figures, but I think we need to think broadly about what it does when we address some of these issues for people. It has a positive trickle-down effect on down the road.
Do you see that it helps the health of families as well?
So, I mean, in the healthcare setting, as I mentioned, you have these partnerships all over the country. So we're getting to the point now where we actually have a lot of data about what they do. And the results are, I think, really, really impressive. Just to give you some examples, the Medical Legal Partnership in New York City, which is actually the largest one in the country, focused really intently on that issue of asthma that I mentioned before, childhood asthma. And if you look really across any city in the country, childhood asthma rates are going to differ really incredibly from one neighborhood to the next, even within the same city, because of the environmental conditions there. So New York City put a heavy focus on that with their Medical Legal Partnership, and they reduced acute asthma admissions by 90% among the people that they were addressing. And so as the healthcare system moves from one that is based on fee-for-service and providing more care to one that moves towards a system where hospitals are going to be rewarded for keeping people healthier, I think this is really essential. Another quick example is a Medical Legal Partnership in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, looked at super utilizers, the few people that were coming into the hospital and using a disproportionate or taking up a disproportionate amount of the medical costs. And a lot of hospitals have super utilizer teams of people who are focused on looking at that population and trying to figure out what they can do to reduce those costs. They put an attorney on that super utilizer team and reduced healthcare costs among that group by 45%. So hospitals are seeing a really immediate payoff. There's some really interesting work coming out of Boston right now where they're actually doing randomized controlled trials. So they're randomizing people so that some people are getting exposure to the Medical Legal Partnership, and they're comparing them to people who aren't. And the first paper on this was just published in Pediatrics a couple months ago, and it found that people, and this was dealing with the pediatric population there in Boston, found that people who were getting legal assistance were much more likely to have their kids on schedule for immunizations, were far less likely to be coming in for emergency room visits, were more likely to be showing up for preventive health visits. So there's really clear benefits from having the legal aid support right there as part of the healthcare system.
Joe, I want to add one thing to what Micah said. It works in another way, too, that we're on the verge of entering into an agreement with Nationwide Children's Hospital, a medical legal partnership in Columbus, which is wonderful. And one of the benefits that I hope we're going to get from that is that the medical staff can also help the legal aid lawyers in their cases. So, for example, with the woman who needed a liver transplant, we can't prove that somebody needs a liver transplant without medical evidence. And I think that the collaboration, a great example is these asthma cases. If we're in housing court and trying to prove causation, between housing conditions and asthma, we need medical evidence. And so I'm hoping that the collaboration will go in that way as well. I don't know how much that's happened in other medical legal partnerships, but I'm excited about that. I think it's going to make us more successful in getting good results for our clients.
And I think you can see from all of these examples, to use the medical care analogy, this is not the cosmetic surgery of legal proceedings. These are legal proceedings, legal assistance that provide basic human needs, whether we're talking about medical care, whether we're talking about food benefits, disability benefits, housing. We're really talking about providing basic human necessities to people that otherwise couldn't afford it.
Well, it makes sense when you explain it like that, but I don't think most people actually realize how much legal and medical care, legal and some of these other areas, how much those situations go together and how much they depend on the legal system. So that's very interesting.
When you mention the word medical legal partnership to doctors, a lot of times they are not so enthusiastic about that idea until you really explain what it is, because oftentimes their interactions with lawyers are not so positive. But this is really a different model about trying to keep patients healthy, and I think hospitals have recognized this, and there's the whole movement towards patients at our medical homes thinking about a person's entire needs, and oftentimes it includes lots of community social services, but they're sort of built on the assumption that if you connect people with those services, they'll be able to access them, and oftentimes that's really difficult, and that's where the attorneys come in and can provide help, because oftentimes claims are wrongfully denied, or you filled out the form wrong, or there are other issues that make these things more difficult than perhaps they should be.
So let me ask you this. What challenges are present in getting fair and equal justice under this system? Are there holes in the system, for example?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, that's yes.
Justice French should take this because of the task force work that the court did that's so important.
Well, yeah, Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor created an Access to Justice Task Force about a year ago. Yvette McGee-Brown was the chair of it. And for those of you who know Yvette McGee-Brown, she got things done. This was not a task force that kind of sat around for a long time and then maybe we would create a glossy report at the end. We really looked at, from a very practical perspective, what are the challenges to access to justice, and specifically the civil legal aid and civil legal representation. The one that is most glaring, and I think one that most everybody would say, is money. And it's not just money to hire lawyers, it's also to fund all of those programs that Tom talked about, where you can reach a broad audience in the community. It's money that can go to the Ohio Legal Assistance Foundation for those same kind of programs and that same kind of funding. We touched on it just a little bit, but one of the primary reasons for this tremendous decrease in funding to legal aid programs is the decrease in interest rates. The way that the system in Ohio is set up is any lawyer that takes in money from a client has to put that money in a special fund for that client. And the interest that is earned is then funneled through to legal aid programs. Well, think about what's happened to interest rates over the last several years. At the same time that the economy was changing, interest rates were going down, foreclosures are going up. So at the same time that the funding is going down, the need in at least that area and many others was going up. So funding is one of the primary challenges. And for those of you within the government, legal aid does not get any GRF money. No general revenue funding from the General Assembly. So we're looking at creating lots of different places to get money for legal aid. But one thing that the task force found, also in addition to just the lack of funding, there are some structural barriers out there. And I'll be the first to admit that many of them are put in place by courts and by judges. For one legal aid attorney that represents clients in, let's say, 30 different counties, well, you have 30 different court systems in those counties, if not many more than that. And every individual judge may have a certain way of doing things. There's no one standardized form for how you file for a civil protection order, for example, or in a divorce case, or for a parenting plan. So one thing that we have recognized is there might need to be a little more standardization so that people who are helping individuals of low income have access. Maybe that access should be a little bit a little bit easier. Things like technology, having online docketing, online filing makes it so much easier for people to have access to a court if they don't have to travel to that courthouse from a physical perspective. So we tried to look at those structural barriers. And finally, I'll also say that I think that the Supreme Court of Ohio needs to be more involved. We need to be there as a partner to all of the legal aid societies. We're looking at having one person designated, a staff member within the Supreme Court, to really keep track of how a particular rule might impact on a legal aid program. But I think that we as justices of the Ohio Supreme Court need to be more involved in legal aid. And I definitely see that commitment going forward.
What about you, Tom? You think so? You think that's needed?
I think that's needed. I think that there are also unique problems to low-income people in encountering the justice system. And poor clients are often very difficult to represent. I don't want to generalize too much, but we have clients who have limited education. They may be illiterate. They have limited English proficiency. They're unfamiliar with the justice system. And they also have a personal lack of resource. Well, they lack money, which is obvious, but it's very frustrating as a legal aid lawyer when you work out a case for somebody and you need a fairly small amount of money to settle it and they don't have it. But the other thing about many of our clients is their lives are held together with duct tape. And so we're helping them with one legal problem when they may be at home trying to come up with a rent because they're about to be evicted, a kid has been thrown out of school, no transportation. And so, I may have put some great case together, and I'm at court wondering where in the world my client is. Well, there may be a real good reason she's not there, and we tend not to think about that. And I think when we talk about equal access to justice, we have to be realistic that the needs of our clients, of poor people, they're not solved just by giving them pro se forms. They need more help than that. And I support assisted pro se that's a self-representation, but we need to recognize that poor people need lawyers if they're going to participate equally and fairly in the justice system.
Well, let me ask you this. You've been around, all of you have been in the working with the legal system for a few years now. In the past, it seems to me, in the past 10 years, there have been major changes in the way the legal system addresses problems, and the problems have changed as well. Can you speak to those changes? Any of you?
Well, I think one change that we've seen is that people we've seen an increase in the number of people who want to represent themselves. We have to acknowledge that sometimes it's not because of money. The judges very often talk about the number of individuals that come before them and say, and the judge might say, is your attorney here? And the individual will say, I don't need an attorney. I don't need a lawyer. I can do this myself. Now, we have to be able to separate out those individuals who do that by choice from the individuals who are really forced into that situation. But one success story, I think, to address that change is there's now a self-help kiosk in the municipal court in Franklin County, and we're seeing kiosks, the idea of a kiosk come up in other courts around the state as well. And that's so that anybody who's in a position of representing themselves can go to the kiosk and just get basic advice about where do I get this form, where do I file this, how much is a filing fee, all that kind of basic information that you and I could probably get much more easily. But that's one example of kind of addressing a change in the legal system. Lawyers are not always quick to change, and judges are even slower to change. And so I think that there definitely is a feeling, though, within the legal community of really trying to come up with ideas of how we address legal aid, not just throwing money at the problem, but really throwing ideas. How can we, in a legal market where you have lots of lawyers who are unemployed, how do we match up those unemployed lawyers with people who need legal assistance? How do we match up those retired lawyers who still want to practice in some limited way? How do we match up those lawyers with individuals who need assistance? So for all of the changes that are happening within society, the legal community, I think, is doing its best to try to catch up with those changes and adjust as needed.
One change that I would be interested, you're the one who said that there are all these changes. We should probably ask what they were. But one change that I've seen generally is the practice of law is much more complex. When I was a new lawyer at Cleveland Legal Aid in 1975, there were little storefront offices all up and down Lorraine Avenue, and every lawyer in every one of those offices was ready to do a divorce. People don't want to do divorces now. It's complicated. There are all these pitfalls. They're afraid they're going to make a mistake. They're afraid they're going to get sued. And I think that makes it a lot harder to organize pro bono programs. It's the reason, I mean, our legal aid programs weren't divided into substantive specialties back then the way I've described now. So I think that's a general change. Another change that I've seen is I think that there's much more of an emphasis on trying to resolve matters both before court and at court. So there are excellent mediation programs, court-annexed mediation programs that are very, very successful, including in the appellate courts. But I also think that another change that I've seen is there aren't as many trials. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. It's not the best way to resolve disputes, but if you don't think there's a trial coming down the road, it's harder to get that settlement done. And I think that the rural parts of Ohio are a little bit less that way, that they're more likely, the judges in the rural counties that we serve are more likely at an earlier point to say, you know, enough talking, let's get it over with and do a trial. But did you have other changes that you thought were relevant that we should talk about?
Yes, I did, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I just want to remind everyone that it's the CMC's tradition to take audience questions. So please step to the microphone, give us your name, and ask us your question. And thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. Now I'm going to follow up with where I meant for that question to go. You kind of alluded to it there. You said, you know, they're trying to, the legal system is trying to do more fixing in divorce situations so that you don't have these nasty divorce trials you once had. You see it in other places, though. You see in housing, in healthcare, other areas where in the last 10, 15 years, the focus seems to be to remedy the problem, get to the problem itself, rather than punish someone for the wrongdoing that may have actually put them in court to begin with. That's what I'm talking about. So have you seen those changes, and how complicated is it to deal with them?
Well, I don't know if this directly answers your question, but just to follow up on what Tom was saying and talk about legal aid maybe a little bit more, there's one legal aid attorney for every 6,400 people who are in poverty. So, and what legal aid does with the resources that it has is just incredible. But it obviously can't deal with every individual's problems, and it doesn't. So I think you're right that there has been a shift to think about what are the systemic issues that are underlying some of these problems that we might be able to get at. Finding the funding to do that, I think, is a challenge. I see my law school dean is here. So I think one way that has worked very well is to actually involve law students who do have some of the bandwidth. If the individual attorneys are focused on their individual clients, but having law students and law clinics get involved can be a way of thinking about some of the underlying issues and ways that those could be tackled. I think on the healthcare side, there are huge shifts going on. I think that's pretty obvious. One that I just wanted to mention is every nonprofit hospital, as part of having its nonprofit status, has to be providing some community benefit. And most hospitals in the past have done that by providing free care or charity care to people who didn't have insurance. With the Affordable Care Act and with Medicaid expansion, everyone in Ohio should be able to have access to insurance, and you've seen the uninsurance rate drop dramatically. That means that if hospitals are going to meet their community benefit obligations, they're going to have to find other ways to do that. So having hospitals as active investors in this process and hopefully thinking about supporting the legal side as one way of doing that, I think is a really important opportunity going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, as the audience, if you have questions, feel free to make your way to the mic over there and ask some of them. And let me just follow up with one more question of my own. What does the community need to be doing to help you folks to be able to continue the services that you're now doing?
Well, that's a great question for this audience. I think there's a general sense that it's really a lawyer's problem, that if only lawyers would take on more pro bono cases, we could resolve this problem. And it's not fair. Lawyers are taking on many thousands and thousands of cases throughout the state of Ohio in a given year. But there are lots of opportunities for non-lawyers to be a part of legal aid as well. If you just were to go, for example, to the columbuslegalaid.org website or to the OLAF.org website, there are opportunities for non-lawyer volunteers. It may be that everyone in this audience can't give time during a business day, but maybe somebody in your household could give some time in a business day. You heard Tom talk about these different programs that are available. It's not just legal representation in a given case. It's also educating the public. For any of you who are in corporations, in-house lawyers can also provide pro bono service. That's a new program. So encourage your in-house lawyers to get involved. Banks can be involved as prime partners with the Ohio Legal Assistance Foundation. So if anything, if there's one message that I would want to get across today, it's that any member of the community can not only be aware of the needs of legal aid and what really is necessary to meet those needs, but that you can be a part of it in many ways in supporting these organizations.
Also, it may have been mentioned already, but we need money.
I'm not allowed to solicit.
And so how should they give you money, Tom, if they want to help with that?
We try to make it easy on the website through corporations and employers. I mean, we're having a very successful campaign with the law firms in Columbus right now who are being very generous. Marion Smithberger is here, has worked hard on that along with Frank Ray. We're looking for partners. We have a wonderful partnership. It's sort of like the medical legal partnership with the Adam Board, where they have a sizable contract with us to have an expedited referral system so that people getting their services can go through the ombudsman office straight into legal aid and get what they need. So there are lots of different ways to help. I don't mean to be flip about it, but it's the top recommendation of the Supreme Court Task Force is more money.
Well, I see some members of our audience here have some questions. I want to remind you to state your name and then ask your brief question to our panelists. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Marie Trudeau. I'm with W.E. Davis Insurance, and thank you for all that you do to deal with that baffling issue of poverty. The Aetna Insurance Foundation did a pilot study where they spent $580 per patient on bilingual nurse educators, and they saved $1,200 on medical expenses per patient, mostly on education. And you can't unlearn something. So I'm assuming this is going to continue on, that these patients who are now educated will continue to be educated and hopefully spread it in their families. So it's your interventions that are, fixing the duct tape. Do you also see it continuing down the road? Are there long-term benefits to what you're doing? Thank you.
Well, one of the biggest issues in legal aid is sort of reconciling the problem that presents and the underlying problem, both for that individual and for other individuals, that is not necessarily solved by solving that person's problem. You mentioned education. Education about legal rights is critically important. We do a lot of, we have brochures, we do presentations around the community and try to let people know what their rights are. But part of what I take from your comment is that in dealing with individuals, we should be looking for the longer range and more complete solution. And all I can say is that that's the way I view it. That is what we try to do. Your example's a good one, and we should do that sort of thing.
Anyone else have anything to add to that before we take the next question? Okay, well, we'll take the next question, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Barbara Poppy. And my question is about a piece of research that was reported in March of 2014 in the state of Wisconsin. And what they found were that low-income women are evicted at much higher rates than men, and that Black Americans are more likely to be evicted. And this was within, as I said, within Wisconsin. My question is, do we find the same level of racial and gender disparities in Ohio as it relates to access to justice for men and for African Americans?
Well, that's a good question.
I'm aware.
Do we?
You don't want that one, huh?
No, I'm just not aware of any similar study in the state of Ohio.
I don't think we have anything on that. I mean, I think we don't talk about race enough in our society. I think we don't talk about race enough in the legal aid society. Most of our clients are white, but a lot of them are minorities. A lot of them are African, a lot of them are Somali and Ethiopian. And do they face worse problems? I mean, being evicted is the least of it. They're getting shot. So are there differences? Yes, and we need to be sympathetic and sensitive to those. My sense is that, well, I'm not sure how to put this. I mean, do our minority clients have a tougher time getting what they deserve? I think they do, but that's anecdotal. That's my gut feeling about it. I can't document it. But my first legal aid job was in Cleveland, in Huff, which is a Black slum on the east side of Cleveland. And I was there shortly after the riots. And there were burned out buildings on the street where our office was. The buildings were full of garbage up to the level of the burned out windows where it spilled out into the street. And there were no white people there. I grew up in Ann Arbor. This was quite a new experience for me. But, you know, when you've been in that situation and had those people as clients, it's life-changing. And do they have the same problems? No, they have worse problems. Other people have serious problems too, disabled people. Women have a harder go of it sometimes too. But I mean, I believe that legal services is about, and legal aid is about racial justice. And we don't talk about it a lot, but it's there.
Sounds like basic communication is a part of that, and that's part of the problem, is that maybe that breaks down with certain populations or situations. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, we'll go to our next question then. Please state your name and ask your question.
Yes, my name is Kermit Whitfield, and I'm wondering if you've talked about the challenge you've had around funding and how funding has gone down. I wonder if your caseload has gone up, and if so, are there particular areas? One of the things I think about is just a month from now, CMC will have a forum on the opiate epidemic, and we've been seeing articles every day about heroin and the effects of that, and I'm wondering, are there cases either with opiates or other areas that you've seen spike?
Well, obviously we saw a foreclosure spike at the time that the cuts came, because that's when the foreclosure crisis was. We were inundated with payday loans, a lot of predatory loan activity. But I mean, what I can say about the caseloads is that losing more than 40% of our staff, obviously we provided fewer services. So we're presented, we have a board that helps us make these decisions, but we're presented with the question, what do we do? We can't do what we used to do. Our caseloads, the number of people that got something from legal aid actually went up during that period. And I would like to think that that's partly because we became more efficient and more effective at what we did. But the sad truth is that the other reason it happened is that we did less for the people we accepted. So when somebody gets accepted at legal aid, where 10 years ago they might have had a lawyer go to court with them, today they might get some advice, a pamphlet, and maybe an invitation to come back if they lose.
To answer your question from a broader perspective for the entire judicial system, the opiate epidemic has had an incredible impact on the judicial system. And I think if you ask any judge in any county in Ohio, they would tell you that maybe 75 or 80% of their docket is in some way connected to drug or alcohol addiction. I mean, that is just that's an incredible number, but they've seen the epidemic have incredible impacts. That might have more of an impact from the public defender's perspective, where you have criminal representation as opposed to civil, but we all know of impacts that kind of addiction has on a family, who then might be facing a housing issue or a benefit issue or a domestic violence issue because of the addiction problem.
Okay. Next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Teresa Long. I'm your Public Health Commissioner. So hopefully you are all healthy and had a great meal, a safe meal. So I really appreciate all of this because there is such an intersection between what I do as both a healthcare professional, but really a public health professional, and everything you're speaking about. But I guess I'd really like to take us all upstream because much of what you've been talking about is individual by individual. And I'm wondering if there's any experience across the country or here in Ohio that would really take on, just like you mentioned, the Huff neighborhood. Is there the ability for legal aid societies, et cetera, to really walk and take on some of the broad neighborhood issues? It could have to do with, again, we call them the social determinants of health. There are economic determinants of health and education. These are the barriers for individuals, families, and neighborhoods in being successful and having opportunity, again, to be successful. And again, I love the medical legal partnerships, but I'm wondering about taking it to the next level.
With more funding, we would love to be able to do more of those kinds of programs. But there are some community-wide programs. For example, the Supreme Court has a program now relating to interpreters and getting interpreters certified that obviously looks at a broader base of not just an individual case, but along a language spectrum. So I think in those kinds of situations, we are trying to look to a whole community. But maybe what we've heard is that in many ways, because of the lack of funding, you are just doing as much as you possibly can in individual cases. But I can tell you that there are an awful lot of education programs out there that do reach more broadly. But maybe that's a question for Micah. That's a real success story for Micah.
So that's a terrific question. And just to start with the medical legal partnerships, as I mentioned, ideally they start with the individual patient, but build up from there. So some of the more successful ones have tried to identify the problems that keep recurring and then try to think about how they can deal with them. So the medical legal partnership in Cleveland, for example, took a look at what the attorneys were often doing. They were often being required to write letters about utility shutoffs or about getting access to special education and other things, and they essentially incorporated that into the healthcare system through the electronic health records. They put in the forms that the doctors could then fill out and streamline the process so they could provide that support much more easily to a lot of people. But then the next step, what you're getting at, is taking it up a level even further from that and going upstream and looking at where the original problem is coming from. And that's a lot harder to do. There are some examples where, Cincinnati, for example, to keep it here in Ohio, they were having an issue with kids who had asthma. The doctors were telling them they needed to run the air conditioning in the summer to keep the symptoms from coming back, and several patients came in back to the doctor with letters from the landlord saying they were using up too much electricity and they weren't allowed to run their air conditioning anymore. And the attorneys figured out that was actually the same landlord in lots of different locations who was issuing those letters. They worked with the landlord and got that problem fixed, not just for those people, but for lots of other people. And actually, it's a longer story, but helped with getting those buildings sold and turning them into a community development project that those attorneys stayed involved with. So there are some terrific success stories, but to really make progress, I think you're right, it has to go beyond the medical legal partnerships. There are lots of possibilities for doing this. I think we have some people here from the Health Policy Institute of Ohio, and they're coming out with a new report next week that I don't want to step on, but I will just tell you to look for that because they're thinking about what are the opportunities to invest in community health, where we're not just looking at the individual problems, but we are thinking about investing in for example, what's called backbone community organizations. A lot of the times, community organizations work in silos. They're working on their specific issue, and we don't have backbone organizations that are funded to connect them to each other and think about what are all the organizations working in this community and how can we address the problems that this community is facing. I mentioned the community benefits issue. I think there's potentially funding there that could be used to do things like what Massachusetts did, where they have a wellness and prevention trust fund, where the state is actually creating a trust fund to fund investments in communities, and those investments are then the organizations that apply have to show that they're going to show tangible results, and they sort of mix it between short-term, medium-term, long-term results, and then those funded organizations are accountable for actually showing their results. So I think there are really exciting ideas out there that probably aren't getting talked about nearly as much as they should be.
I see there's one more person, so if you can make a really brief question and answer here as Kelly comes back up to the stage, we'd appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. I'm inspired by Mr. Weeks' personal statement. I'm wondering how Professor Berman has inspired new law students and faculty and law students to take this cause on and have the same passion that the three of you have for it. How does it get inculcated in a new generation of practitioners?
Well, don't know that I'm the best person to answer that question. Yeah.
Can you go to the mic, please? Thank you.
Professor Berman is part of a partnership between the College of Law and the College of Public Health that is inspiring our students. Just second year, or now third year together, but with the two joint hires our colleges made, law and public health, which just didn't speak each other's language as an academic matter, are now doing lots of joint projects. We have students working together. We have some of the assistance programs that we're designing with external partners that we from the law side, I've put out proposals to foundations to support medical legal partnerships. I wouldn't have known about that without Micah, and Micah and Efthimi have helped us draft that, and students are flocking to them. So yes, he's doing it.
So,
Thank you.
So if I just two really quick comments. One is, I think the only way you do that is to get students outside of the classroom and really working in the community and seeing the need and working with it. The second thing that I think is the real trend in academia, and Dean Michaels alluded to it, is interprofessional education, getting law students to interact with public health students, to interact with medical students, and realize that they're going to be working together for the rest of their careers, and get them to think about how they can each contribute their own strength to solving some of these problems.
And just as a final note too, this generation of law school graduates, they are already committed to legal aid. I think that is something that we see coming out of not only being taught by the law schools, but they do have this sense of needing to give back, of community service, and already being committed to legal aid.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Kelly.
Thank you very much for that. I hope you enjoyed today's forum. Remember that you can view and share all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, National Church Residences, Barnes & Thornburg, and the Ohio Legal Assistance Foundation, and our speakers, Justice Judith French, Tom Weeks, Micah Berman, and Joe Ingles. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you at CMC again soon. Have a good day.